All right, well, thanks for coming, everybody. There's ginger snaps and chocolate going around. I consider that to be essential to any good talk, that there's good food as well. So yeah, I thought it'd be good to get in on the gun tea cycle early in my time here. I've been here about 3 months now. And probably the most relevant project that I've been part of that might touch most of the gun community, or at least more than other things that I do, is this natural capital project. So pretty much what I want to do is 3 things today. Talk about just the basic, what is this thing we call the Natural Capital Project? What do we do? What's it about? Who the people are, just so you know the kind of coalition that I'm part of, and you'll probably start seeing their faces around here now that I work here. And then some deep thoughts about what we've done well and really badly, what the future should be in my view, what the kind of frontier issues are, and how all this might tie into collaborations at the Gun Institute. So the whole idea is to do all that in about like 25 minutes or so. So there's lots of time to talk. And maybe like a hybrid between just talking throughout and letting me do the whole spiel is maybe I'll pause after each of these and see if there's questions each time, so we don't get too far before you get a chance to weigh in. That's not fair? Yeah, okay. So the basics of the Natural Capital Project is a collaboration among these 4 places: the Nature Conservancy, Stanford University, WWF, and University of Minnesota. And we essentially exist to do 3 things. Develop these tools that map and value ecosystem services, and you'll see some of those. Test those tools and apply them in critical regions for biodiversity that these NGOs are interested in conserving. And support policies to maintain ecosystem services or pay them in various ways, pay for them, to incentivize conservation around the value of nature. So that's kind of the basic idea. It's been going for about 5 years now. And this is really what motivated the whole thing. The 3 founders, and I'll show you them in a little bit, are all veterans of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which is this big global effort to quantify ecosystem services. But in our view, it didn't answer anybody's real question. A big like starting gun for research, big attention-getting publication. But these are the things that when I worked at WWF, environment ministers or WWF field programs or watershed managers wanted to know. They heard about ecosystem services. They wanted to know, where are they coming from? What are the trade-offs among them and with competing land uses? If I do this, what do I expect? How would a proposed logging project, we got that a lot, or road project, or any project you might want to consider, affect different ecosystem services and biodiversity? And who's going to benefit and who's going to lose or bear the cost? So how are those benefits and costs distributed? These are sort of the decision-maker questions that, again, when I was at this science program at a global NGO, people asked all the time. And we realized that the Millennium Assessment didn't really answer that. And a lot of very tiny kind of plot experiments were answering that. So we tried to form this coalition of NGOs and universities to answer those types of questions. Okay, so the what? Let's talk about the science for a minute. Probably the most fundamental part of the approach of the Natural Capital Project is for each of these ecosystem services, these benefits that nature supplies people, we try to figure out a simple production function that relates the service as a function of a variety of inputs. So this happens in agriculture all the time, like labor, water, fertilizer, seed, all is functionally related to the amount of crop you'd expect. You should be able to do the same thing in a much more complicated world for ecosystem services. So that's the basic thing, production functions. Here's a couple of examples, just to say that it doesn't look that simple. These are 2 that actually get strung together as part of our pollination model, which I work on a lot. But again, it's different aspects of the ecosystem service. This is now yield as a function of stuff, which is a function of this. But just to give you a sense of what production functions, when I think of them, look like. It's a mathematical expression of what's contributing and combining in the right ways to produce an ecosystem service. And the reason I like this approach is that it does that. It connects these key inputs to the service output, and it forces you to understand what's going on. As opposed to kind of guessing or picking a number off a shelf or something, it's trying to force you to figure out what attributes of the ecosystem are important to deliver this service. And once you have them and believe them, and we can talk about how much we believe them, then you can do all kinds of things. You can predict change, you can forecast change through scenarios, and you can model and extrapolate over landscapes. So they're powerful, but they're hard to produce. So what we've done essentially at the core of the Natural Capital Project is set out to write down production functions for as many ecosystem services as we're hearing people want to learn about. So we've just been doing that for a while, and this is the current list. Those in italics I wouldn't really stand behind. They're kind of, there's a version, but I'm not sure how good it is. And those in not italics are actually published now. We started terrestrial and freshwater, and we've more recently been funded to do marine, so that's catching up fast. So it's the normal stuff. I'm not going to read through these. You guys are aware of what ecosystem services are. But these are the kinds of things for each one of them we're trying to get at this production function. So, and I say invest at the top. Invest is this tool, this set of ecosystem services models that the Natural Capital Project has produced. And it's our kind of shorthand for this, a set of production functions that relate inputs to ecosystem services. So one of the things that we chose to do early on, so 4.5 years ago, was to write a book about that. Just to force ourselves to have the fights, figure out how to write these things down, dive into the literature, distill something simple, and write it down. And so this book just came out last year. I'm very relieved to tell you. And it essentially writes down the theory and the math and the justification for each of those ecosystem services I listed in the front screen, except for the italicized ones. So there's 10 chapters at the core of the book, service by service by service. And if you'd like to look at the book, I should have brought one. They're in my office. If you'd like to look at the book, I'm happy to have a GUND copy circulate around. So this was edited by the founders of the Natural Capital Project, and it's full of, the approach we think is true to the state of the understanding, but is very simplified, so people could pull it off in lots of different places in the world with the data that are available in lots of places. So this is trying to put down the science foundation, and it was a huge project, as anybody who's done this kind of thing. 110 authors, 5 editors, 4.5 years. 3.5 of those years were delay, right? So we thought we'd do it much faster than we did, but it did. It did what it was supposed to do. It forced us to settle it and fight it out and get it reviewed, and some chapters spent 1.5 years in review. And the editors, we wouldn't let it go out without reviews finally being okay. So the book's one thing we've done scientifically. We also just write papers, right? We use these tools as we develop them to ask general questions about ecosystem services. This one's asking about possibility frontiers, like what are the ways you can optimize this landscape in the Willamette Valley that optimize the trade-off between income from marketed goods and expected number of species. So some of these are ecosystem services and some of them are more mainstream goods. The point is, here's the trade-off curve, right? So you can get a lot more income without much of a hit in biodiversity, and then it really falls off a cliff. And the shape of this curve didn't have to be that way. It could have been this way, and that's bad news. So these are the kind of conceptual issues. Probably the biggest issue is that's the current landscape. So say what you will about what our priorities are, we're not on the frontier. We're not maximizing what we could. We can't play God across the whole landscape, which is why it's kind of a theoretical paper, but that's the kind of stuff we've been doing. This is also stuff that I've worked on a lot, which is the marginal values, like what's the cost to each farmer in the landscape of the next unit change in forest in terms of pollination services to coffee. So we can talk about these more if you want, but it's just to illustrate too briefly that we're exploring kind of the issues around ecosystem services using these models. But the thing that most people know about it is this software tool that has packaged up the contents of that book into a GIS plugin so that it's a little more point and clicky for a user to be prompted for the data they need and to have all that math churn in the background. So it's not the sort of slickest interface in the world, but if you're already a GIS user, and everybody who works at WWF and TNC already are, then this is something you can get free off the web and have these functionalities. What we hear about this tool is that, well, lots of things. We hear mostly that it makes it more possible than it was before to have these analyses done for yourself, but it also, we hear that the burden of creating the data that go in is really a big hurdle. That's the barrier to use. So it's not that it's not slick enough as a software tool, it's that it requires a lot of data and a lot of understanding to compile those data. I frankly like that, because I worry about this being a little too easy to use and people using it without enough understanding. And right now that data barrier forces them to know what they're doing before they use our tool to set some policy. So this is kind of our way of trying to mainstream this so it's not so wonky. We're trying to make this possible for anybody, not just a group of scientists to use. And packaging it up in software, and there's a user's guide and online help and a community that you get enrolled in and you can ask each other questions and things is our way of doing that. When I last checked the website, this has been downloaded 2,800 times in like 75 countries. And seriously, every week I get an email about somebody showing us how they've used it without us even knowing they did. So that's kind of one of the more satisfying things, is that people are just taking it, using it, and we're helping them less and less to do so. So you can get it there if you want. You can Google on it, but it's at the ecoinformatics.org. That's the NC's site. And we have a grant to work with Google Earth Engine to put it in a much more point-and-clickable way. That, I must say, has been kind of a disappointment. They are not the fantastically exciting group to work with that we thought they'd be when we landed the grant. They have other priorities that have included us for a while, so that's been slower than we thought. Okay, so that's the science, and the science is really like a lot of stuff that I like, and the place I used to work, and I think one of the missions of the GUND'S Institute. Science is not just to do the science; it's to apply it in places and make policies better, or inform decisions, or to make clear to those deciding how to use land and water what the consequences for ecosystem services are. So I just paused there because maybe I'll just stop for a second and make this one of these question points. Anything that wasn't clear, or you want to chat about the science? Yeah.
Are there people right now using Invest in their research? I'm just curious.
In this room?
Yeah. I mean, is there anybody that's like played with it?
What? So I know Ken Bagstad has.
Okay.
Is that the only one?
Ken has a nice paper coming out that's comparing all these different tools.
Fantastic. Marta and Ferdinando were working on one too, right?
Yeah, Aries.
Part of this?
No.
Aries is a different platform.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons I thought I'd use my
That's the
first
deep
gun
reflection
to-
part, right?
Right, exactly.
Bring it all together.
Don't build it up. It's not that big. So yeah, I mean, the take home from the science is that we've got this kind of theory, I guess you can call it, in place in the book. It's packaged up in this software tool, which is not as approachable as we'd like, but it's got all that, the math in the background. And it's allowed us to try to ask a bunch of sort of general questions about ecosystem services, in addition to setting up this applications bit I'll talk about in a second.
And just quickly, and when you get your output from Invest, can you get it in like physical indicators and monetary indicators, or how does? Yeah.
Yep. So I'll get to that slide in a second, but yeah, you can actually, there's actually a checkbox in the tool window that says, do you want to run the economics or not? And the biggest, no, you'll have to wait till the end to hear what I was about to say. Okay, so again, the point is to improve conservation and inform it with ecosystem services, not just to do science. And these are the demonstration sites that really, I think, are the big contribution of the National Capital Project. In each of these places, we're testing Invest with field partners and experts, although the testing is now taking a back role to actually advancing their goals. And we're just starting, and Steve Posner knows about this a little bit, about thinking about rolling up and sharing lessons, like when is this working, when not, has it made a difference, how would we know, that kind of thing. So because we have a stable, we have like a sample now that's approaching 15 of data that we can learn some lessons from. So each of these circles is where either the Nature Conservancy or WWF has decided that mapped information on ecosystem services would help them get their job done. And they've come to the National Capital Project and said, here's why. And we've actually made them convince us of that, because a lot of people aren't quite sure why, they just kind of want some of this stuff. And we really decided that mapped information could make a difference. And so they're running the field aspects and the policy connections in country, and we're this kind of mapping skunkworks in the background. So each of them is driven by them. We lead none of these. And I like it that way, it's by design. Here's getting to your question, Josh. So, and each of them is not just, hey, let's just run this tool and get a map. It tends to follow this kind of process. So we start with stakeholders and we ask them, what's this question facing you that you think ecosystem services could inform? And we try to distill that issue into a set of scenarios, like build the road, don't. Follow these policies, don't. Expand this protected area, or don't. And if we can capture the decision in terms of map scenarios of ultimate land use in the future, then that's what drives investing, can show the differences. So if we have those, and that's a big part of the trick, If we have those, then we can run INVEST biophysically and produce maps of where the ecosystem services are and are going to, trade-off curves like the one I showed you from Steve's paper, even balance sheets in biophysical terms. And again, if they select it, you can run valuation models on that. And the whole idea is this final era, right, is to take those consequences of their options and bring them back to stakeholders and say, based on what you told us you're facing in terms of a decision, here's what we think the outcomes might be in terms of a range of ecosystem services, whatever subset of our list you said you were interested in. Okay, so that's the basic idea. That's kind of going on in every one of those circles. So I'm just going to tell you one story from one of those circles, and I can tell you about more later if you want. This is one that's just kind of unfolding now, so I dropped it in here. I didn't have it when I gave my job talk, and now we do. So this is central Sumatra, an island in Indonesia. And this central part is a set of provinces in Sumatra that are going through sort of an island-wide land use planning, government-mandated thing. Every 10 years they do this. They've kind of planned the island for where development, restoration, and conservation should happen. And now that planning is going on within each district, which is where the kind of rubber hits the road policy-wise. So the governors are committed in this statement of the governors of Sumatra that they will plan development, conservation, and restoration of the island based on ecosystem services, right? Benefits to people. When they say that, they think about water, and they think about carbon, and they think about biodiversity. They kind of lump those together. And so they said that, and they'd have no idea how to do that, so they went to the WWF office in Indonesia and said, help us understand where the ecosystem services are. And that office in turn came to NatCap and said, help us help them figure out where these are. So that's why we're involved, and that's our role, to map those sources of ecosystem services and then to recommend options for capturing those values. So there's a lot to this that I won't talk about, but this is just to kind of illustrate how this goes. So here's very simplified land use map of natural plantations and other is kind of built up. So natural is in green, plantations is in orange, and the gray are towns and developments. And they have two different pathways. One is the sort of existing plan, sort of the existing plan of governors, and one is this new one they want to usher in, they call the Sumatra Vision. So already the visioning work, the scenarios work have been done over the course of 2 years about how they'd like their island to look, and you can see that it involves a lot of restoration of forest. There's a lot more green than there, but a lot more green than even here. So these are the two contrasting scenarios that they asked us to evaluate for them. And here's just one example. So here's carbon, current carbon, using our carbon module in the software tool. Darker is more carbon. Here are those famous peatlands that are burning and releasing incredible quantities of carbon per hectare.
Is this carbon stock or carbon?
This is stock. And how we think about the sequestration and change is just among those scenarios. So, and then this is the change from 2020 minus now under the existing plan, and the change in the Sumatra Vision, right? So under the kind of existing plan, red is loss. You lose a lot of carbon in those places because the peatlands would continue to burn. That would be stopped under the vision. So you can difference in time, like what's the trend in time, and then you can difference among them. And what this kind of rolls up to really is you can make these kind of amoeba diagrams, right? So every axis of this thing is a different ecosystem service or value or benefit. The dashed line is essentially zero change, and the dark line is the change between that vision and the plan, right? The greener future and the business as usual future. So carbon stock, you get a lot more carbon if you go the vision future than the business as usual. You get a lot less water yield runoff death. So you can look at several aspects of ecosystem services in kind of one snapshot in these kind of spider or amoeba diagrams. Is that clear? So that's one kind of trade-off-y thing you can do. You can also ask things that WWF wants to ask, like, look, how important are tiger landscapes? So in red are these places that WWF's, I've almost said we, WWF, I get out of that. WWF's identified as important for tigers, right? These red outlines. And underneath is water yield from our water yield model. You can just ask a very simple question, like how do tiger landscapes versus the rest of the landscape differ? Are they on average more important as sources of water than the rest of the landscape? And each of these sets of bars is a different district, so just look at one set. And for carbon, they are more than 500% more dense in carbon than the average landscape. So tiger landscapes tend to be carbon dense. They're a little bit less important for water yield than the average landscape, and they're almost half as good for sediment retained. And other districts have different things. So in a district by district way, we can say, you know, tiger conservation is going to be reinforcing ecosystem services or not, or or not. So one of the big surprises to me in this whole project, which I'm kind of embarrassed I didn't see coming, is this tool, just the process of getting it working in workshops in country is a really important engagement tool. You know all about this, right? Why I didn't see that coming, I don't know, but people kind of understand that nature's got value and they don't really know how to think about it, and then you're asking them for data, and you're running the models while they're away at lunch, and they're done when they come back, and they say, wow, okay, there's a map that I helped produce, and they're like, well, that's not right. We know we have better data than that, and so they improve the data and they run it again, and it changes. They actually see that it changed because of what they knew. And that has people at the end of workshops, and I'm sure areas and minds groups have found the same thing too. Being able to look at a map and change it when you have knowledge that's better does wonders for kind of buy-in and ownership of the result when it finally happens. So this is a group in Tanzania, the one that I've been most personally involved in. And this is like a grad student. He works at the university in Morogoro. This guy runs like the watershed authority. This guy's from the vice president's office. There's a whole group of different people. You may know some of these guys, John. Interacting and arguing and improving it. And so as an engagement tool, it's these kinds of things are effective too. Okay, so that was by far the longest section. You'll be happy to know. Any questions before I go to who? Yeah.
So to what extent, when you're doing your services, can you see, you know, like a benefit, who the beneficiaries are?
Yeah.
As spatial distribution and everything?
It varies among services. Some are really good at that. Some you don't care, right? So carbon, it's all of us. Things like pollination and water, you couldn't have done it without that, so it's very easy to see the beneficiaries. Others, I think we've done a pretty terrible job. Like the one that I'm least happy with, and that's one of the reasons, is non-timber forest products. So all the things that people harvest directly from forests. And it depends a lot on where they are, who they are, how far they can walk, and we don't capture that very well. So that's going to. Yeah.
Can you put economic outputs in one of those axes in the middle diagram?
Yes. Yeah. So some can be economic and some can't. Some don't have to be. And you can still show the trade-offs in mixed units.
Is it weighted at all? And like, for example, would the tiger thing be more important than another services because they have different priorities? And how would the weightedness affect the?
Yeah, you can just apply weights to all those axes if you want. And you can get really fancy. You can integrate underneath that amoeba and just compare alternatives as their aggregate area. That's getting really quantitative about it. Or you can just kind of inform the debate by showing the trade-offs. But that's kind of the nice thing about prices and about getting to dollars is that weighting's been done. And you can pool on even terms, at least in theory. When it's mixed, there's a whole bunch of like criteria, multi-criteria analysis things you can do. Yeah, you missed it.
So I don't know if this is more a question, have you thought about it? Because I
Yeah.
don't see it there at all. But when I saw that Sumatra map, and it's coming from the government, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what about if, you know, they would get the best bet by reforesting an area that's populated by poor people,
Yeah.
and you know you would get your best ecosystem services management if you and then the ministry just said, okay, so we're gonna get these people out of there and reforest.
Yeah.
Is there?
Yeah. So it's going to be in my deep reflections
Yeah,
part, but that's one of the three big frontiers, I think. And NatCap got big fast. And we spent some time catching up and getting organized to be efficient with how big we are, and part of that was like a strategic plan. And we identified sort of three research frontiers for the research function of NatCap, and that's one of them. And it gets at your question, which is you need to know the delivery, like the beneficiary, the flow from where they're produced to who gets them. And then you need to know something about those people. And so those two things are two of the kind of research priorities. There are a couple of examples that do that well, but not many. Got a hand back? Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering what, this is a huge project. What was your role in the overall project?
See this who thing coming up? Yeah, that's the. So I founded it. I was one of the 3 founders, and now I'm called a director, I think. And I'll show you that. But so I founded it as this. We got a little grant from NC's, which is the synthesis center in Santa Barbara, and a postdoc. And the 2 other co-founders, Gretchen Daly and Peter Grieve, and I thought we'd have a fun little research project together because we all had way too much management in our lives. And then within 2 years, this thing blew up into this big management problem. So I don't do much research anymore, which is the whole point. But I guess what you'd call me now is one of the directors. And then I've helped to develop 3 of the modules. And when my old job, I helped run the applications in Indonesia, in Tanzania, and Uganda. So, yeah.
So my question's sort of related to Ernesto's. That picture that you showed of engaging people, it seemed like everybody that when you mentioned their roles, they were either university affiliated or government affiliated, and I'm wondering if this has had any success in engaging sort of the lay audience, or if you see potential, maybe eventually when you're addressing sort of that issue that Ernesto brought up.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think we've done a good job of that. I think we tend to target decision makers, and often the ones that are sort of empowered to make those decisions are government officials and things like that. So we're trying to improve and inform their decisions. I think we can do a better job of kind of empowering people who may not be in the position of that decision-making authority. And in a couple of cases in the Andes and in Brazil, we've done an okay job of that, but I wouldn't say we've done a very good job of it in Indonesia. It's a really good question. All right, maybe take one more and then I'll...
Do you always have to have data for running the invest? I mean, if the country or region doesn't have data, how do you run it?
This is a huge debate. And there are some people within NatCap that want to have global defaults, so right out of the box you can run it and play around. And I'm one of the people that argues really, really strongly against that. I like the barrier to entry that is data and understanding, and I worry a lot about this being used in really dumb ways. It's not Google Maps, right? It's actually producing a value-laden result. Google Maps should be instantly usable because it's not really doing anything but just showing you the facts. This has all kinds of judgment decisions and stuff in it, and I just worry about people using it without the understanding. So far I've prevailed, or my camp has prevailed. What is it? Inertia's on my side. So we've kind of decided not to make a big effort about global defaults. But if we do things like Google Earth Engine, it's going to force the issue again. What we do have is a training data set on a mythical place with all the data there. So you can just, in pretend land, see how it works. But we actually refuse to tell you where that is. All right, can I go on and then? Okay. So who? This is really brief. I think it's just one slide. So again, you might start seeing these people, so you might want to know who they are. Mary Ruckelshaus is this managing director we hired a year ago, and it was the best thing we ever did. She used to work at NOAA, ran the science function for the Northwest of NOAA, and she's the one who got the Marine grant for the first time with us from the Moore Foundation and decided this is the funnest part of her day, so she quit the rest of her job and just came to run the thing.
Is she related to Bill Ruckelshaus?
Was that?
She related to...
She's a daughter of Bill Ruckelshaus. Yeah, right. Well, she probably knows that. Yeah, so she's the daughter of Bill Ruckelshaus. Peter Kariva, chief science at CNC. I was the director of the science program at WWF. Gretchen Daly at Stanford, and Steve Pulaski at Minnesota. So those are what we call the directors, the kind of people who started it all, and then the woman we hired who's phenomenal to run it now. And then it's a big group of people, but basically it's in 6 bins. So there's terrestrial science, marine science. We just hired a software person who hired another, so we're actually going to get better and decouple ourselves from ArcInfo. We have a policy group that I hired at WWF that's involved in sort of the process of translating science into change. We have a bunch of people, this is just 2, that are in charge of shepherding WWF and Nature Conservancy field sites through using Invest. And then we have a kind of growing support team. So these are the numbers of people that are actually in each group. I decided not to give you every single photo, but this is kind of what we decided the kind of bins of work are. Advance the science, package it much nicer than we have, help people connect it, and then help people with it. So a few of you have been connected by me to individuals here, and I would love to see more of that happen as your interests intersect with NatCap. All right. Any questions on who? So I stick to my pattern here. All right, fine. So I have 3 slides about deep reflections. One is the things I think we've learned, one is the frontiers, and one is the GUND connection. So pretty much the hardest lesson is that this striving to keep it simple but be rigorous at the same time is a pain in the ass. And you get hammered from both sides. So we get ravaged by reviews because our models are way too simple, and we get ridiculed by field programs because what we're asking is way too complicated. So it's this continuous fence-walking existence, and we try to have different tiers of models, simple ones, and then more complicated at tier 2 and so forth. But the overwhelming response we get is, where's tier 0? Tier 1 is already can't deal. Whereas we try to publish some of the stuff we work with tier 1, and we get all kinds of professional hydrologists who say, I can't believe you've simplified the hydrology this much. So maybe that's evidence that we're kind of right where we should be, or maybe we're just idiots, I'm not sure, but that's been the biggest difficulty for me. Multiple services is hard but worth it, so I think the biggest environmental decisions have lots of different axes to them. Ecosystem services in their variety, biodiversity, distributional impacts, and so refusing to just do someone's carbon map for them has been a policy of ours, and it's turned away potential collaborators from us who just want some water stuff done. But we kind of think that the time's around now to take a look across the breadth of ecosystem services. And so it's hard, there's more data to get, and you have to sort of figure out how to simply show the trade-offs, but I think it's worth it. This is the one that I dodged before. So maybe the biggest surprise is that most of the field programs don't care about economic valuation. They tend not to click that box. And when I got into this, I thought everybody just wanted to put dollars on nature so they could argue economically about it. And most people just want to know where the important places are, measured however it matters. And that's been kind of a wake-up call to me. Also, most applications aren't interested in payments for ecosystem services. I guess those 2 things are related. They want policies and incentives that don't depend on private transactions. So that's interesting. I mean, we killed ourselves about sensible economic valuation techniques, and people don't tend to click that damn box. Okay, and then the last thing is we got into trouble when we didn't answer their question. We thought, here's a cool place, let's do our own study here. And we didn't listen well enough to what they really, really wanted. And we did some cool science and we got some papers out, but in terms of impact, we kind of fell flat. So this is kind of a new mantra. And NatCap is what's their question. The frontiers, these are, I guess, mostly scientific. There's this beneficiaries and distributional effects. So I think the field generally is bad about that. I think the flow of sources to beneficiaries is something that ARES does actually pretty well, and that NatCap does very sloppily at best. So it's one of those like strategic plan frontiers we've identified, and there's a couple of people now focused on that specifically. Another one I'm really interested in, and so is John, are the health impacts of ecosystem change. So not expressing it in biophysical terms or economic, but in terms of health outcomes. So I'd really like to have these models and understanding be able to link unit changes in ecosystem condition to changes in health outcomes like emergency room visits, daily adjusted life years, like concrete things that the health community measures in terms of public health and development. It'd be nice to relate those, just like we've been trying to relate things to economics. Uncertainty, you notice none of my maps had error bars or bar charts had error bars. That's a big problem, because we're trying to inform decisions. And we have very simple ways. Now all the modules have min, max, mean, and it'll track 3 answers for you, and you can just put these crude whiskers on things. But there's nothing about the shape of uncertainty around most of these parameters, and that's part of the decisions we made about simplicity and tier 1. Try telling somebody about the distribution of uncertainty around this parameter when you're in your average field site, and that's when people start telling you things are too complicated. So that was an early choice to just be simple about it, but we're undoing that now that we've come along a little bit. And the last one's not about science, it's about making it scale. I think we tried to make INVEST simple so that people could start using it without us. And that has roughly, until very recently, not happened. To do a really good demonstration site, you still need us. And that is completely unscalable. We are not a limiting factor. And that's not the dream. The dream is have this be so dead easy that everyone can do it themselves, and we facilitated that. And I don't think any tool has come close to doing that. To being user-friendly and clear enough that people can use it without as much help. So typically it's a training workshop of a week at the very least to get people using this. And maybe that's as good as we'll get, but they often need more help down the line, and we're still at that point. So we've not figured out how to make this truly just scale. By the way, I hate it when people say scale like that as a verb, but I said it. It's just like, it's not, anyway. It's very web, Silicon Valley. Okay, so here's how this fits that gun thing. And I guess I just have like the beginnings of ideas on this. Obviously, this has been the place that 2 other very similar sounding tools, right, with very similar goals. In structure and approach, very different, but the thing they're trying to do is they're the same. So now there's a third here at GUND, and we should talk about how to take advantage of that, frankly. So here are the 4 things I think, for now, and then we can talk about it. One is, I think we should focus on answering people's questions and getting work done, not on what tool is best to use, right? So we can just use whatever tool fits best and concentrate on doing cool science that matters and informs decisions. So that's the first thing, is I'd kind of like to not make it a tool-off. I get invited to too many tool-off panels with Fernando and others. Secondly, I think there's a real opportunity. I mean, now the sort of the genes of each of these approaches is under one roof, so to speak. So I think without some grand synthesis, I'm sure there's a lot of shared understanding we can do. We can take components that we're good at and swap them around in a kind of gene swapping lateral transfer way. And that's already beginning to happen. So Steve Posner's getting involved in a couple of the kind of science to action things. Maybe he might do a project like that. I'm really pushing to have NatCap come to UVM in the fall. We have an every 6 months all project meeting, and it should be at UVM, they say. And then who knows what kind of cross-fertilization can happen when that happens. I think one way to work together is just to go after those frontiers I mentioned. Forget about kind of the tools thing, but let's think about beneficiaries. Aries is good about that with the flows. We've got a postdoc application into USDA that would bring a postdoc here to work on flows of benefits from source to beneficiary. Also health. I mean, John's really interested in health through his Holly project. We have more foundation postdoc to link ecosystem services to human health through INVEST. And it's the big interest WWF has in working with me when I'm here. So that's an obvious one that we can work on together. And the last one that's on my mind a lot is maybe we should open up a demonstration site in Vermont. I'm not sure what the question is, and I'd like to know what that question is, but food systems and the trade-offs among alternative land uses comes to mind. I'd love to evaluate the ecosystem service impacts of the Vermont Land Trust. There's a scenario, right? Vermont Land Trust did what it did. Vermont Land Trust never existed. What are the ecosystem services that have been secured because of their, and maybe what are their values relative to what they've had to spend to do it. So those are kind of the early ideas. I think if we had INVEST kind of running locally, we could ask a ton of questions over the years that relate to spires and lots of interest from people in GUND. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'd be Yeah, an obvious one is to ask the question about windmills everywhere in Vermont.
Yeah.
And the question is, suppose you try to apply this to the Keystone Pipeline.
Yeah.
Imagine that local impacts, aquifer disruption and so on would be a routine part of it. Would the larger part about increasing carbon, et cetera, and global feedbacks be a part of that?
I don't think so, if I understand your question right. So you mean the increasing carbon because we're burning all of that
Right.
stuff coming through the pipeline?
Yes, and it's less efficient than...
Yeah. So my immediate answer is INVEST is not a good vehicle for that, for the sort of global feedback. It's a land use change based, best if used in sort of a spatially explicit regional way. So the idea that we're burning more, climate's changing faster, that's a tough thing to capture in this kind of model.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Back to those windmills.
Yeah, right. Or the local effects of the pipeline. Yeah.
If you were to kind of take on a question like that, what kinds of data inputs would you need? I'm kind of curious if you could drill in a little bit more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can talk more later if you'd like. Decided not to spend time on that. So the most important thing you need is a land use line cover map. And if you want to do any kind of scenario changes, you need the alternative future loss too. So when I'm telling people to invest in data collection, that's the number one thing, is it drives every model, whereas some data just drives some models. And then it depends. So on carbon, you need an estimate with error of per hectare density of carbon, right? Above ground, below ground, however many pools you've got it. And you need harvest rates if it's a harvested forest, and you need ideally the fates of that wood. Is it going to paper, or is it getting burned, or is it going to furniture? So you can see how some things are simple and some things get a little bit nuanced, and you can see how sometimes you need to discuss what the data should be. That pool, what it turns into, turns out to be really important, right? So for any kind of used forest, it takes a very few years before the pool of tables and chairs and houses is dwarfing the carbon stored on the piece itself, on the land itself, right? So it turns out that's a really important thing to track, which is the only thing nuanced about the model at all. The rest is just like a land use and a per land use cover type density. So let's, for the water ones, you need a DEM, so you need to know topography, and you need a flow model, which is often the hardest thing because DEMs are noisy and it crashes flow models. So you need to know where water's going, and then you need to know kind of per hectare inputs of pollutants and absorptive capacities of pollutants, and then you route water through those inputs and filtration points. If you want to do any kind of economic evaluation with water, you need to identify who the beneficiary is. Is it a dam or is it farmers? And you need to know where they are and what they need. So I kind of, for each of those, went from the simplest stuff to the complicated stuff. And in all those stages, you can just assume you don't know, and it'll get a simpler answer out. But that's kind of a flavor of it.
And is there a certain, yeah, that's really cool. And
Yeah.
For resolution, are there kind of different scales or?
Yeah. We've built it to be without scale, and it's been used everything from across the whole U.S. to a single ranch in Hawaii. And it seems like nothing's really a problem. The only thing is that some of the processes are so local that it doesn't make sense to do broadly. For example, pollination. So bees fly around at the scale of 50 to 200 meters, 300, 500 maybe. So to do that for the U.S. is crazy, because each grid cell, all the important stuff's going on within one cell. So pretending that each cell is homogeneous is crazy. Doing it for, it's much more summable and scalable for something like carbon. So that's the only constraint. If you're just smart about it, there's no limit to scale. Yeah.
I'm curious about your finding about the not about the money piece.
Yeah.
And do you think that's influenced because you've been working with so many policymakers who maybe are governmental and that they're driving toward policy instead of maybe a capitalistic assessment?
Could very well be. Yep. I particularly tend to work in the developing in this project, And I think, yeah, it's probably just like less capitalistic and about trying to make a market. I'm just thinking though in Tanzania, one of the reasons we were asked to work in Tanzania is that they did have a water fund set up, that CARE and WWF set up, and they got 2 buyers, the water utility in Dar es Salaam and Coca-Cola, who had a plant there, and they put into a fund, and it was the fund's job to allocate the money to best impact, and they had no idea how to do that. And one of the reasons we were helping them is to try to point to watersheds that were probably most sensitive, to which the water supply was most sensitive, right? Improved land use practices here is going to make a bigger impact than down here. So that one was about a payment, essentially, and still they just wanted relative ranking of some watersheds, right? So they weren't trying to make the money pitch. So I think that could be the reason. But part of it also just still confuses me. I don't really understand why, after all this hoopla, people are less interested in money than I thought. So, yeah.
Can you give examples of where private enterprise has used this model?
Yeah, we only have 2 that I know of. One of them, we actually worked with Lafarge, which is a huge mining company, because we wanted to see what it was like to work with a private company. Because one of the audiences we always say we have is businesses whose supply chains depend on ecosystem services or who control a lot of land. Lafarge is one of those second things. They have huge holdings of mines, reclaimed mines, areas that they have bought the rights to and they've not exercised the rights yet, but they still control land. So they had a mine in Minnesota, in kind of middle Minnesota, and they just wanted to know what the value of ecosystem services was flowing off this land and whether there's something they could do to diversify revenue, they sell something, or just understand their role. And so we worked with them. They wanted things super, super simple as well. But in the end, we produced across 4 different ecosystem services what reclaiming the mine versus leaving it kind of a disaster scraped area would have changed. So that's one. And the other one is, God, this is going to sound even worse, it's Dow. So Dow, I'm not part of this one, I'm just going to say that right now. So Dow gave the Nature Conservancy a huge amount of money to help them think about ecosystem services and how they could, one of the many ways they're trying to increase sustainability at a giant chemical company. And so NatCap's getting some money from them to look at, I think it's water issues around plants. So I think the other one that's not private but may not be as expected is the Department of Defense, also a huge landowner. And they want to know what the benefits are coming off their land. So there's 2, we have a pretty big grant with them to assess, I think, across 5 different bases. Because they hold lots of land and they leave it untouched because it's like buffer for palm rangers and stuff. So that's 3 examples. Saw a couple of, yeah, I've seen.
Well, the trade-offs are very sensitive to the beneficiaries, and
Yeah.
I'm wondering like how you plan to extend this invest model that accommodates those trade-offs among different sets of beneficiaries at different scales.
Yep. So I think the way this works in my head, and again it's kind of unfolding now, is I kind of think it fits with the approach of Invest to have mapped information on demographics. So it could be poverty, it could be all kinds of different measures of segmenting communities. And then track much more carefully and make a much bigger deal out of the arrival of ecosystem services at those points of use. And then we can subset those spider diagrams by poor, not poor, 3 different income classes or whatever. That to me is the dream, and that's kind of the approach that would fit within our approach so far. We're all about mapped information about sources, about flows. If we can follow those flows all the way to report points of use, and then have that lay on a map of where different segments of society are, then we can really ask winners and losers questions. So my dream is to have like 3 different spider diagrams for every result.
If I may.
Yeah.
So hey, Azim, I represent the Aries project. And so there was a reference earlier that we worked on flows, and so that's the core component in our framework. We have a theoretical framework called SPAN, which is Service Path Attribution Networks, that maps all ecosystem services in terms of, spatially, in terms of a four-tuple of sources, those are the ecosystems where the service is provided, and uses, where the beneficiaries are located, information about that. Elements called sinks, which are landscape components which interfere with flow. In his example, like with pollution movement, this would be places in the landscape where, for example, pollution is sucked up by sediment or other features. So sources, sinks, use, and then the flow paths that connect them together. So anyway, this thing is all laid out in actually a series of papers that I published on this a few years ago, and this is what's implemented for all of the Aries ecosystem service models. They all explicitly connect the flow paths from the sources to the users, so that then in scenarios you see trade-offs for what beneficiaries gain and lose.
Yeah, I mean, I see like a kind of a merger between Invest and Aries in a sense of like populating the Invest GIS layers of different scenarios with agents. And I think Aries is an agent-based model.
Aries is not an
more or
agent-based
less,
model.
or it's more like an artificial intelligence model, but
Aries is a
you have
modeling
agents, right?
Aries is a modeling platform which is a semantic modeling platform for model integration, and we have a suite of ecosystem service models, which is what we built on top of that, that connect together a variety of models, including Bayesian network models, direct arithmetic models like the kind of production functions you showed, as well as Bayesian network models and network flow models. I'm sorry, agent-based models and network flow models. So it's integrating different kinds of models together.
Yeah.
But it does include agent-based components.
Right, right. I mean, to add the beneficiaries on that landscape, I think you need to have some kind of agent-based component in there, like maybe post-processing of the invest-generated scenarios of different land use, and then populate them with the agents. And
yeah, that'd be one of the many things that would be fun to talk about.
Just an idea.
John.
I love the comment you made about the workshops, because I've been a part of these various kinds of workshops with lots of types of models.
Yeah.
Invest, Aries, Dimes. Probably a dozen more.
Yep.
And to me, like, everyone in the workshop thinks it's all about the map, but in the end it's not about the map.
Yeah.
It's about the conversations in the process, and they all go back to their agencies or to their NGOs or to their governments, and by being part of this and thinking about all the diverse values, functions, and relationships and the beneficiaries and stuff of ecosystems, it changes the way they think about their jobs. And so I just want to kind of put in an extra plug for that the process of running these kinds of workshops and using the model almost as a straw man that you can beat up on, and you know, we as researchers get all hyper-focused on, oh, it's not accurate enough, and we need better data. But when you step back from these workshops, and I've been part of many of them through the years, it's like, that's the outcome.
Yeah, it's totally true. And that's one of the reasons everyone asks us for tier 0.
Yeah.
One of the reasons sometimes I despair, like, wow, we killed ourselves trying to be actually good. And essentially what people want is like a video game, an educational video game, right? That's what tier 0 is, right? Yeah. And so there have been lots of proposals like, let's make sim services. You know, I've been in a meeting every year where someone's like, yeah, let's make the next video game. And that'd be a good idea because it gets, it's a quicker path to what you're getting at. It also relates, Steve, to the things that you're kind of interested in, like how has Invest helped the policy discussion? And it seems to have most often helped at the stage you described, sort of get it on people's radar screens, get them thinking in new ways. I thought it would actually break the tie between build the road there and build the road there. They're like, well, that says here, so here. Right. And it turns out it's much earlier in the process than that. It's at the sort of just expose people to the idea that ecosystem services exist, here's roughly what they do, and there are many of them and they interact, you know. And it's kind of, I guess I'm saying the same thing you said, that this basic eye-opening function seems to be what people at these circled sites tell us was the most valuable thing about this.
And just before we wrap up, I want to take the opportunity, we've got so many gun people here, to introduce Chris. Chris is here as a visiting scholar for the semester from Clarkson. Chris, can you introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, quickly. I'm Chris Robinson. I'm a political theorist from Clarkson, here to study the political implications of ecological economics.
And he's going to be.
I'll be talking to a lot.
Occupying the back corner of the gun here.
It's nice. It's nice.
Back to Vermont. Right now, Burlington Electric, we continually ask the question about what's renewable, because they want a renewable future. There was an opinion piece in the Free Press in the last week in which somebody said, we're looking at wind turbines one at a time. What about the cumulative effect in the state? So I'm thinking that something like this would really be useful for two reasons. One is just wildlife ranges and so on.
Yeah.
And second, what happens when you've zapped every ridgeline and you can't make calendars anymore? So anyway, the idea of tying together the wind question at the state level is relevant to Burlington Electric and Republican.
Yeah. That's cool. All right, maybe we can stop, and if you want to ask me more, I can stick around for a while. Thanks for coming, everybody.